Welcome to Side by Side, a podcast where I, Robert Kwong, take you inside conversations with artists, creatives, healers, and warriors taking the charge in their transformational story. Today's guest is Julie Pham, a self-proclaimed karma breaker who blends the spiritual with practical application, the ethereal with the tangible. In this conversation, we dive inside her journey balancing familial expectations with her innate gifts, her transition from mathematics to energy work, and the importance of recognizing generational patterns in order to create the future we want. Yeah. How have you been since whenever we last spoke? How's life, Julie?
I think last time we spoke was before the new year. So a lot has happened actually. We had I think the most recent energetic thing was the full moon,
Mm-hmm.
and that was big energy. And then there's also big energy around the new year. So I actually felt the shift from the previous year to the next year. It felt like the energy of 2023 will be more action oriented, more physical manifestations. I feel like the prior years were more about introspection, doing a lot of shadow work.
Hmm.
And it's really cool because there are other influencers in terms of people that are astrologers or intuitives that agree with the energy that they're feeling. So it's good to get that validation that other people are feeling that as well.
Yeah, kind of getting a lot of confirmations from each other, which is so nice to have other people to sort of like be able to back up your intuition. And also I know you as someone who's very unapologetic about being a highly sensitive, intuitive, and someone who's known that for a long time. Whereas some other folks would not have stumbled upon some of the breakthroughs that early. So I'm really curious because I don't know if you've really dived into your origin story that much. When did you start knowing or noticing that you were highly sensitive and started noticing your intuition and that maybe something was a little bit different about your experience of the world from some of your peers?
Yeah, great question because we never have discussed my origin story. So people often ask me, how did you know you're intuitive? Or when did that start for you? And honestly, it started as a child. I would have really kind of paranormal kind of experiences very early on, but you really don't have the language for it. And you're also very confused about what's going on. So when I have discussions with my sister now about it, she would say, "You didn't tell me what was going on." And I would say, "How do you describe ghosts when you have no language for it?" Or seeing spirits because you also don't have any language for it, nor is anyone talking about it. And she said that I would just shut down and be scared about certain things. But that was the first thing. Like I would see spirits very early on. And then the second thing is I would have premonitions very frequently where I would dream things that would come into fruition in my waking world, which was pretty gnarly, I would say, at the time, because when you journey in dream world, it's very vivid that when you're awake and it happens in a premonition and it's also incredibly vivid, that line between waking world and sleeping world becomes kind of blurred. So as a child, it becomes a little bit disorienting. I would say now I definitely have a handle on it. But that's kind of how I kind of started off because I would say to my friends all the time as a kid, "Oh my God, I had a dream that this happened, like this exact thing that we're experiencing right now." That it became a ongoing joke between my friends. They would say to me, "Are you Dr. Martin Luther King?" Because every sentence I would start with is, "Oh my God, I had a dream."
I can't imagine growing up and having to understand or figure out the mystery of some of those experiences when you're so young And also, I would assume that your exterior world was not really reflecting all of these things as a way of like, oh, this is what's happening, or oh, the world understands. I am curious, growing up as a first generation Vietnamese American, how did that inform your journey in understanding this aspect of yourself that I don't know if it would get discussed or talked about in such a manner?
So, by the way, I'm Vietnamese, Chinese, half and half, I believe.
Mm,
But
okay.
it definitely had its pros and cons. So I'll talk about the pros first. The pros is that the Asian culture, I think across the board, is pretty superstitious. So they very much believe in spirits, and that's not something that's shut away. So I appreciated that being very openly accepted. My all of my aunts and uncles and grandparents have seen spirits back in Vietnam, especially during the war, because there are a lot of people passing over. So it's an interesting story. It's a family story. I've actually never really shared with many people. And that's the fact that I remember one day I was a kid and it was a family reunion and everyone was together and somehow it came up where all the sisters were like, I never share this with anyone, but at home I used to see this spirit wearing a really long nightgown and long hair. And then every single sister was like, me too. I never talked about it. I was so scared.
Okay, so you actually did have confirmations, and in fact, from people within your family, which was that a relief for you?
It was something that allowed me to be more open to it, I would say. Whereas, Western culture, I think it's very much not accepted to be in communication or even see spirits, especially in the academic world. So I was gonna say the con of that is like in Asian culture or mine, I think across the board, academia is very much of high importance. So I remember like my parents would say, it doesn't matter XYZ, like it doesn't matter if you're pretty, it doesn't matter if all these things, because we know war and we know what it's like. The only thing that matters is your education. So that was very much stressed because they knew that no matter what happens, it can be taken away from you because it happened to them and that being educated will be your best bet at having a successful future. So, being an academic world, everything intuitive, everything of that nature is just not accepted whatsoever.
Yeah. Well, you did eventually get a degree in mathematics. So was that sort of due to the influence of societal and familial pressure? I mean, or did you actually genuinely really like mathematics too?
I would say the former. I do like solving puzzles and looking for patterns, but it's just so interesting. Like I wish someone would tell me there is no real handbook for this thing called life. Even what your parents tell you is not really the only path. Like there's so many different paths and so many different careers. And I remember just recently asking myself or having a discussion with friends where they asked, what did you want to be when you wanted to grow up? And I could never answer. And I would get so stressed about it because I really wanted to know. And I would think about it because everyone said whatever you wanted to be is what you should be. But we only had like, what, five options? Like there were many options.
Yeah. What was it sort of expected of medical field, law, sciences, things like that? Is that what you're referring to as far as
Yeah,
paths?
it was definitely that. I had like my parents were very much tiger mom and dads, I would say. Like at an early age, I would have meetings with my dad where he'd take me in front of a whiteboard and he would map out different career paths I could take, the SAT scores I needed to have, the extracurriculars, and the colleges, and also like the income stability.
I'm sure some of it was informative, but So you did eventually go to college, received a degree, earned a degree in mathematics, and at some point you did decide to go full on, full in with doing intuitive work, healing work, spiritual work. What made you decide to make that transition ultimately from the societal expectations and these different paths that are most commonly accepted to where you are now?
I would say if I were to sum it up in a nutshell, it'd be the fact that I felt like my soul was dying. It's kind of insane, but what it would be is that like so after I got made fun of and it wasn't really accepted, like all the experience that I was having, no conversations, I eventually shut down my intuition. I eventually did it as almost a survival mechanism to be accepted, where during the formative years, your main priority is acceptance within the peer group. So I would shut down my intuition, and I would say it wasn't until after college that I had a huge kind of dark night of the soul where I kept sabotaging every single thing that came up. Like I would have interviews with JP Morgan. I got to the third round interview. Everyone knows when you get to third round interview, it's basically you're in, we're just signing off. Now the higher ups are meeting you. But I was asked the question, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And I just blurted it out and I said, not here. I didn't even know what I was saying.
No way. Oh, that is very metal, to be honest with you.
I didn't even know, like, I didn't even understand what I was saying, that so much so that I didn't understand why I didn't get the job. I didn't realize that connection, that I blurted those things out and that's why I didn't get the interview. Now it's so clear. I'm like, oh, geez, why would they invest in me if I don't even see myself at that company. But those kinds of events, plus nothing feeling right, and self-sabotaging every single thing I tried, it just felt like I was doing everything possible to get out of it, whether that's taking 2 hour long lunch breaks. Like I would do those things. It's nuts. To finally realizing that something greater was calling me that I didn't know. And I was in New York City. I remember very clearly I was having this like existential crisis with my life where I didn't know where I belonged. And I felt really hopeless. And I was looking for any sign. And I'm sitting in Union Square just by myself. And there are these readers, in the middle of the park. And I said, what the hell? Let's get a reading. So I get a reading in the middle of Union Square. And in hindsight, it wasn't a great reading, but she did say a few things that really resonated. One was, you're meant to have your own business. And I was like, yes, I feel that deep in my soul. And then two, I think she said something like she might have even said there's something greater calling me, like maybe even healing things. I'm not quite sure in the second, but I remember vividly that it was definitely along the lines of you meant to have your own business. And then after that, everything started to be kind of fall into place rapid fire, where I realized I was highly intuitive. I could read people, and I would do events. I would do blind readings for people where I didn't know them, strangers from New York City. I would do readings for them, and everything I said was validated. And that's when I knew I wasn't making it up. And you could even say scientifically, I'm gathering empirical evidence that it's happening repeatedly, case after case.
That must be such a turning point. And where you are now, the way you work with people, how might you explain the way that you would support someone if they come to you with an issue or with a specific, how might they work with you if they had an agenda, an issue, or something that they don't understand, or perhaps they want to cultivate their own intuition? What are you picking up from them that you could then use to support their healing journey?
Well, first, what I do is when I engage with someone, I don't really listen to the words as much as I listen to the energy. So I'll ask a series of questions, but I will listen to more of the energy of what's being communicated. And then I'll see if we are a right fit or my modality is a right fit for them. My modality now as an intuitive healer is finding your patterns. This is where we come full circle with my math degree. I
Hmm.
said with humans, finding the patterns within humans,
Mm-hmm.
which I now have leaned into the terminology of karma, because I feel like it's more encompassing. It's a cycle that we play out that can be passed down through generations, that can be from our past lives. And it's something that we carry with us until it can be broken and we can release ourselves from that cycle into a more liberated path of our Dharma. So that's where I specifically work with people through a few modalities. One, obviously, intuition, hearing it, hearing their pain points, hearing what's actually there. And then, secondly, through my pattern recognition of saying, oh, I see a cycle here. It literally lights up, like blinks. It's like, oh, here's a sign. That's their pattern. And it lights up, and then I see other little lights go off, and I'm like, oh, okay, this is where it's playing out again in all these different ways.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. And you and I have worked together, and I remember meeting you right at the start of the pandemic, which was an interesting time. And I had not explored these ideas so much that I thought were quite radical at the time. And I remember coming to you, and some of the things I was really focusing on, maybe intuitively myself, knowing what was about to come, was around the discussion of energy hygiene, and maybe a little bit similarly to protect one's energy so that you can protect your well being. So, do you have any just general tips or advice about when someone starts to notice how their energy gets affected, or they want to cultivate their intuition, but it's something that you have to care for? How can one start to look at where they are in their energy hygiene and then start to support that?
Yeah, great question. I think this affects a lot of people. And the way I first like to frame it is that just like we have a physical body, we do have an energetic body. So just as we do maintenance on our physical body, like brushing our teeth, taking a shower, washing our hair, you know, clipping our nails, we have to also do maintenance on our energetic body as well. I like to use also the analogy that we kind of walk around with an aura, which I sometimes give the visual of like walking around with a certain color of paint. So let's say like my color of paint that I'm walking around with is pink and gold, because it is. And then someone else is walking around with the colors of like blue and light gray and a little bit of green. And then depending on what's going on internally, it can shift. But think about it as like a bucket of paint that each person walks around with. When we engage with one another, whether that's a hug or discussion, whatever that is, those paint colors are mixing. So let's say I give someone a hug or we're having a discussion or someone comes to me and they're talking about something very heavy. Their grays will actually touch my energetic body and then I'll have bits of gray on me. That's from them. And so it's really important to recognize that just because you can't see it, it's very much present. You can definitely feel it. So there are practices of energetic hygiene to say, okay, like that's not mine. That's obviously not mine. Like my color, I know my color, I know my default, I know what that is. Let's wash away that gray. So I say, like, first is understanding that energetic hygiene is as important as physical hygiene. The second most important thing is recognizing what's yours and what's not. And that's what really trips people up.
Mm,
So that requires knowing yourself really well. What is your, I call default state, which is when no one else is around, how do you feel? Do you feel like maybe your baseline might be anxiety? That's very prevalent now. Maybe your baseline's very calm. Maybe it's very rapid thoughts. Whatever it is, figure out what your baseline is when you're alone. There is no other way to figure it out. You can't figure it out if so many people are around you because you're going to be influenced by them. But when you're by yourself for a whole day, or if you have a few hours, ask yourself what your baseline feels like. And with energy, everything's pretty subtle. So try to write down as clearly as you can. Remember that feeling, what it's like to feel just your baseline. And then when you interact with other people, you can notice a deviation from your baseline. So let's say I hang out with someone that's super anxious, which happens frequently. Sometimes I'll even change my energy to help that person become more calm. And you could do that by slowing down your speech, creating a different cadence. But my point is, figure out the difference between your default and someone else's so that you know when and how someone starts affecting you. Three would be actually the physical practices. There are physical practices and energetic practices, but the physical practices, which are various rituals, they can be as basic as saging and Palo Santo, or even baths. Love baths.
Oh,
um,
yes.
that if you carry an intention with it, you can really cleanse your space physically. But yeah, that can be a whole hour long discussion.
Yeah,
So
there are so many tricks actually, or, practical things that you can do. And I remember you talking, or actually you teaching me some of these things, like how you start your mornings, right? Opening the windows, checking to see your space, where does it get the most natural light, cleaning your space, using water, like taking baths and showering intentionally to cleanse your energetic space. And those were some of the things that I have applied ever since I spoke with you. And to me, the idea of taking care of your energy and your spirit and well being is deeply tied to how fast or the way that someone could break a cycle or start a new cycle. Can you go into when someone has something that keeps repeating in their life? Maybe they have started to notice, how many times can you have the same argument or discussion or something like that before you start to notice this is repeating itself. But then after the fact, how can one start to work with someone or start to work with themselves to say, I want to change this, I want to break this. But it might not be super clear what that might look like.
yeah, well, first I want to say something that I liked that you just said, which is you said that the more you do energetic self-care, it can accelerate your growth and healing and all those things. So I really want to give recognition to that because what it essentially is the more you do self-care and energetic work, you're understanding yourself more. And that's really the key to all of it is understanding yourself more. And so when you do that care and you do that deep dive, you get to learn yourself, what you like, what works for you, even the small things like, oh, I really like having plants around. I didn't know that about myself. Or I really, gravitate towards animals. Why? All these different things. But okay, so identification. So this happens often, I think, when you start coming into adulthood, where you notice that you do things just like your parents. That's one recognition.
Yeah.
When your partner says things that you've noticed that you've said about your parents, like let's say like you have complaints about your mom and then your partner mimics the same language that you've even said about, your parents, about you, and you're like, holy shit, I'm turning into my mom or I'm turning into my dad. That in itself is karma. You learned a pattern. It's been passed down and you're repeating it. So that's one big pattern identifier. Or it could be the fact that you recognize that you are attracted to the same partner or same situation over and over and
Mm,
over again. And it's the
right.
same outcome over and over and over and over again. So let's say you have an abandonment wound and you keep attracting partners that are not available. And every single time they're not available and can't commit to you. And you're saying, oh my God, I keep doing this. The same kind of person over and over and over again. So that's another way. I think it's really clear to see it in relationships because it evokes so much emotional reaction out of you. It can be in jobs too. Like every single job you have, maybe your voice isn't recognized or your ideas are stolen from you. And every single time you move to a new job, you think it's going to be different, but it happens again. So it's that kind of pattern that you stop and you go, oh, this has happened before. this has to stop.
I think even coming to that moment is such a big breakthrough for so many of us. At least it has been for me and will continue to be, I'm sure. You talk about one way to identify karmic cycles is through your family lineage or your ancestry, right? And the way that it's been passed down from generation to generation. Is there any way to, I mean, I guess my question is, how do you distinguish the impact of ancestry versus looking at one's past life?
Yeah. So I would say the easiest identifier is actually knowing your family history as best you can. Obviously, you can start identifying it with your parents because you have firsthand kind of exposure, and then knowing what else has been happening. So, like, if you really go in deep dive into the psychology of your parents or even your partner, whoever's closest to you, no matter what, you start seeing the the patterns or cycles that are played out. It's kind of hard not to see. Like every single time you deep dive into someone's psychology, you start seeing how each person and player has kind of shaped that person. And then you see the dynamics, and then you can see how
Mm,
they were then affected by their parents or siblings. It's as soon as you start opening that access point of a wound, you'll start seeing dynamics start playing out like a story. And then you're like, okay, here there are players that have affected you in this way. And then you can see it like, for example, if you have karma with your mom's lineage. And usually this is an interesting thing too. You usually take on one lineage, not both, which is something that I don't like I've energetically seen in people. You don't take on like the mom and dads. You usually have a more dominant lineage that you have carried over. There are facets of both, but usually one's more dominant. So let's
hmm,
say you're more dominant with your mom's lineage, and how in your mom's lineage there are certain dynamics, whether that's being in a space of see what the dynamics are with different categories. What's their dynamic around money? What's their dynamic around love? What's their dynamic around conflict resolution? And once you start exploring all these different categories, you'll start seeing like how that's been shaped. If your parents have already started breaking karmic patterns, then you won't see it as heavily in your own life. And
hmm.
that's why we have to really do the work, because we're healing for our ancestors. Our ancestors weren't able to heal it, so it gets passed down so that we can heal it for them and for ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. You and I have also talked about the idea of sound healing a little bit, even though, it's not, maybe it's not directly related to your spiritual work, but it's something that you even supported me around. From a spiritual, intuitive sense, what is the power of vibrational frequencies, music, sound that seems to influence and impact so many people? For example, I remember we were talking about what was it, Stranger Things? I think it was Stranger Things. And there was a particular episode that was about how one state could be affected by their favorite music or maybe memory tied to things that are around music, and which I also relate to vibrational frequencies. But not to put you on the spot, but yeah, how would you explain the power of that and why it is something that we can work with on a spiritual, intuitive level as well?
So yeah, the reference was Stranger Things, and I forgot the redhead's name. Do you remember her name?
The character, Max, right?
Max. Yes.
Yeah.
So Max is getting sucked down to the upside down world, and they realized, and so what it is like the upside down world is a different dimension. And they realized when they play her favorite song, it can tether her to their dimension. So what that really means is music or sound is interdimensional. It can pass through different dimensions, and it can even anchor you into yours. So that's what happened for her. She was getting anchored into back into her present dimension, so she didn't get swallowed up in the upside down world. It means that frequency in itself is, for me, I would say like the universal language for the thing that can really move through dimensions, time, and space is like sound and frequency. I think it's the probably the highest technology there is.
That's so funny you say that because there's so many, creative and musically minded people in this world that have these gifts and are attuned to it. But I wasn't really thinking of it that way when I was training to go to music conservatory, obviously. So it's so funny to have a different perspective on that and how we can work with that, in this world, in the 3D world. I suppose, given that you are a channel, if there are other things that you want to bring up, please do so. But I suppose I wanted to ask you before our time is up, what are some things that you would want to share with people about 2023 or the energetics of the upcoming near future? In fact, I think you kind of touched on it a little bit right when we started, but
Okay, full disclaimer before I say it, to feel into it yourself and find
mm-hmm,
what you feel is to be true. I'm a
mm-hmm,
huge advocate for everyone listening to their own intuition. So, what I feel about 2023 is not 2023, but at least the future, because timelines can be a little bit finicky for me. But I feel like there's going to be a huge shift. I think that COVID kickstarted it. And the shift is where a lot of old constructs will start deconstructing into new paradigms. So things that aren't working will naturally fall apart. And I think that it's because timelines are starting to become more, are starting to merge. So I think that that's happening. I also think there's going to be a huge wave within our consciousness between technology and those who are adverse to it, and maybe an in between too. Some people are very much like technology is the way forward. Some people are saying, wow, I'm noticing all the changes that technology has done in a detrimental, such as social media. Tons of studies are coming out right now saying how it's affecting the future generations, the social media. Like, for example, because of social media, there are studies that are coming out. They say that kids are no longer having the same intimacy. So they're like have high anxiety to get on a phone call. They can only text. They're also like the stats are previously in our generation, people that were going out on dates was about 80%. It's dropped down to already 40%. People aren't going on dates anymore. So like there's this huge kind of like schism happening where it's like some people are really on board with technology and where it's moving. And I'm not saying either is right or wrong.
right,
And then
right.
there's another which is like, okay, this isn't working for me, especially the generations I think that were able to experience both. Like our generation's really cool. We got to see what life was like without technology, and then we got to
Mm,
see what life is like with technology.
right, right. We were the last generation to be able to compare, I guess. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, so we can see what life is like. And like, I still remember my first Game Boy. That was freaking awesome.
Right.
So I think there's
Oh,
going to be
that's so
a
true.
shift, like I think either people are going to say like, yes, this is the way we need to follow this. And some people are going to start pushing back and say, no, it's not the way. We need to find more balance. So I think that's also going to happen as well.
Mm. Well, I am all about balance and finding balance for myself. Thank you so much, Julie. Is there anything else that you want to share? Because, as we wrap up, I would just ask you, like, how can people find you? But if there's anything else beforehand, please do share as well.
I would just really like to leave the message for anyone listening, the reminder to drop into yourself. I think that there are so many influences out there, and by all means, it's amazing to gather information from all these different sources, but I think it's really powerful to drop in with yourself consistently to remind yourself who you are, what you stand for, what you represent, what matters to you. And then from that space, when you fully drop into yourself, how you want to move forward. When dropping with yourself can mean being present with your body, it can also mean listening to your intuition. So that's one of the biggest things I think that's really important for everyone to do. So yeah, I think that's what I'd like to say.
Yeah, thank you. And if somebody wanted to connect with you, find you online, work with you, how might they do that?
So if anyone wants to find me, you can find me on Instagram or my website or my email, but I'll give you all of them. They're around the same. So Instagram is Julie Pham XO, and I think Julie Pham, P as in Paul, HAM XO for Instagram, and then my email is juliepham.co@gmail, and then my website is www.juliepham.co, not com, just co.
Thank you for your time today, Julie. It was so fun chatting about this stuff with you as always.
Yeah, it was such a pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in. And if you'd like to connect with me, please reach out at www.robertkwongcoaching.com. And also feel free to reach out to me on Instagram at robertkwongcoaching.